Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the New Republic Live. I'm Cora Currier. I'm a contributing deputy editor at the New Republic. I edit Sold Short, which is the desk at newrepublic.com focused on inequality. And we have been running a lot of pieces lately on childcare. So I'm here with a wonderful group of writers who have been thinking a lot about this issue, the impact of the US childcare system or lack thereof, and the impact on parents, on children, and importantly, on the workers behind the system. So let's jump right in. I will introduce our panelists. Marta Martinez is a multimedia journalist and currently a senior editor at Latino USA. Her work has appeared on the New Republic, the Washington Post, Vice, Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, and Univision, among other media. She specializes in long-form journalism covering human rights, gender, inequality, and migration. She's reported on a sex-based quarantine measure that discriminated against transgender people in Panama, a community built by displaced Colombians that is now welcoming migrant Venezuelans, how the genocide trial came together in Guatemala, and why straight women are marrying each other in northern Tanzania. She worked as a fact checker for the New York Times and as a researcher for the New Yorker. And she last wrote for us for Sold Short about an effort by the National Domestic Workers Alliance to capture the impact of the pandemic on domestic workers who are often left out of official data. Then we have Kendra Hurley, who is a journalist and researcher whose work has helped shape policy in childcare and early education, child welfare, and other social services. Her writing has appeared in publications including the New Republic, Bloomberg City Lab, and the Washington Post. And her investigation into teen adoption received an award from the Casey Journalism Center. For over a decade, Kendra worked as a senior editor and reporter of the Families in Poverty Project at the Center for New York City Affairs, an applied policy research institute at the New School. And before that, she spent several years co-editing a magazine written by and for teens in foster care. And her last piece for the New Republic for Sold Short was about how parents, contrary to popular belief, are actually lousy consumers when it comes to picking quality childcare. And finally, we have Bryce Covert, who is an independent journalist writing about the economy. She's a contributing writer at The Nation, and her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Time Magazine, the Washington Post, New York Magazine, Wired, Slate, and others. She won a 2016 Exceptional Merit in Media Award from the National Women's Political Caucus, and she's appeared on ABC, CBS, MSNBC, NPR, and other outlets. Her last piece for the magazine was about an experiment to give a basic income to mothers in Mississippi. So with that, I'd like to jump right in with an opening question about how the pandemic made the inadequacy of the US social safety net abundantly clear. And one of the places that was most evident was with childcare. Parents and caregivers are going on over a year and a half without reliable care, even when your kids are back in school or daycare. A runny nose is enough to send your week off the rails. Childcare centers, which were already running on very low wages and profit margins, have had to close because of the impact of the pandemic. And many immigrant workers and informal nannies, housekeepers, people in sort of informal childcare positions were summarily dropped by their wealthy employers at the start of the pandemic. So I'd like to have each of you kind of go around and give an example of how the pandemic sort of brought this care crisis to the fore in the work that you've done. Let's start with you, Kendra.
Okay. Yeah, so thanks. So when I think of what happened with the pandemic, it's really three big buckets in the childcare arena got exposed. And the first one was that it really exposed the fragility of the business model that most parents depend on. And we depend on this market-based system, and that kind of in many ways collapsed during the pandemic. And it's worth noting that in Quebec, this didn't happen. The childcare system there, where they have universal childcare, is emerging pretty much unscathed and in better shape than the rest of Canada, way better shape than here when so many centers closed. I also think it's exposed the way childcare has always been subsidized on the low pay of the early childhood workforce, where They're paid, it's made almost affordable for parents by paying early childhood educators really, really low wages. So that's kind of, and now we're seeing a big teacher shortage in the childcare centers because of that, because people aren't coming back. They can make more money in lots of other places. And, I think the final thing is that employers and society and politicians in general, parents have really protected them from the tenuous nature of the childcare system that we've all had to rely on, because you want to seem like a reliable worker even after you have a kid. And so, childcare has always been something we kind of do discreetly and don't talk about. And I feel like the pandemic, literally ripped the curtain off that, where you had kids, bursting into Zoom meetings and parents unable to work. And it's really shown how much the bottom line of businesses and employers is actually dependent on this area that's kind of been invisible until recently.
Bryce, how about you?
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. And I would just add further that I think one really interesting thing that was particularly exposed in the pandemic is how childcare holds everything else together, including school. I think, we tend to separate school and childcare as two different things. And I think it became really clear in the pandemic that they overlap quite a lot. And school is a place where your kids go to learn and also to stay safe while you're at work. And when that's taken away, like, everything becomes chaos. And we saw, millions of mothers drop out of the workforce. Many still haven't come back, especially as this school year began again and was not really back to normal. We saw another drop in September. It's affected dads too, but it's really fallen on mothers. Just this fact that, you take school away, you take childcare away, and all of a sudden, parents can't show up to work. I think that was always true, but to have it happen en masse like that and to be so widely shared, and as Kendra said, showing up in your face on Zoom calls as kids are running around, I think really just was a wake-up call for everyone as to how critical this is, and also how little we do about it, particularly for young kids and older kids. Outside of school hours, we do very little to help parents figure it out. And so, like she was saying, this very private concern really became a public one.
Yeah. Marta, what would you add?
Yeah, I guess I would add that I feel like the pandemic created this opposition between women kind of picking up the slack at home because they had to take care of the children, because they had to take care of the home. We know that in the end, it's always women who, or in most cases, it's women who end up doing the care work. And it's been so for centuries. So in the end, it's the work that's been invisibilized that women take on during the pandemic. But I also wanted to kind of highlight the fact that there's this other side of all these women who were working in people's homes, who have been so invisibilized at the same time for so many years, not being able to work because we were all in lockdown. So it also showed how all these domestic workers who are doing essential work as well for all of us all the time became completely disposable. And these are people who are completely out of the system. They don't have salaries. They can't apply for unemployment. A lot of them are even undocumented. So they were completely left alone without any kind of support while we were all in our homes. Yes, overburdened and very busy, but there are all these other women who have been working in our homes who were completely, left without any kind of option or resource. And at the same time, and that's why I was looking at the work of the National Domestic Workers Alliance and how they were gathering data, real-time data on how the pandemic was affecting these workers that are actually very difficult to reach. Because what was interesting is that 3 out of 4 of the domestic workers they were surveying were the main breadwinners in their families. So we're talking about key figures within their families as well that suddenly lost all of their jobs.
Yeah. So another, when we've all been following the ins and outs of the Build Back Better bill and Biden's plan for getting these big social spending provisions through the reconciliation process. It's been a big up and down. There's been a lot of confusion and changes as to what's actually in it, and we still don't know what will survive. But maybe Bryce, if you could start out like telling us a little bit about what right now is on the table in terms of the various childcare provisions that Biden and Democrats are proposing, and some of what's been dropped along the way.
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. I mean, I almost feel like I don't want to say I know for sure this is where things stand because it's so in flux. We've had Biden's initial plan, and then what Congress was trying to do to make it legislation. And now, for those who haven't been following as closely, there are conservative senators, Democratic senators who, two of them basically, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, who are demanding that it all be whittled down a lot. So Biden came out with a revised plan. The House has its own revised plan. It's unclear what the Senate's going to do. So that's just all set up to say, initially, Biden wanted to have universal preschool that the federal government would cover the costs of, at least for the first few years, for all 3 and 4-year-olds. And that would be free and open to everyone. For younger ages, it was a more complex subsidy system that would, for certain parents under a certain amount of income, cap their costs, their personal costs at 7% of their income, and the government would pick up the rest of the tab. And it would also include money to increase quality, including paying childcare providers on par with teachers, preschool teachers, because right now they tend to make money more on par with like fast food workers. So that was the original plan. From what I gather, both of those things are still in there. There is now a work requirement in Biden's plan for the childcare subsidies, which it has a wide variety of things that you can do to qualify. You can be working, you can be in school, you can be on leave, like all these different things, but it does require you to sort of submit the paperwork over and over, which has been a huge barrier in other programs. So there's some worry about whether people who really need it most will actually get it. On the preschool side of things, they still want to do it, but originally the government was going to pick up the full tab at the first few years and then sort of taper off how much it was going to give, and the states would have to pick up the rest. And now that's less. It looks like they're giving states less of the cost. And the danger there is, if you followed the Medicaid expansion in the Affordable Care Act, the government wasn't able to force states to expand Medicaid, but there was a huge incentive because the government was going to pick up a lot of the tab in the first few years, and then it would sort of taper off. And a whole bunch of red states said no thank you, and haven't, there's still a number of states that haven't expanded Medicaid. So the worry is states may not opt in to preschool, and then we end up with the patchwork system we see with Medicaid. So I think that's where things stand. Honestly, it could be different. It would be a huge step forward if any of that passes, even with all those caveats I mentioned. It would be completely different than what we do now and historic, but the devil's in the details, and also these opportunities don't come along terribly often. So I think there's a lot of concern that if it doesn't get done right the first time, we're going to end up with whatever it is that they do basically from here on out.
Yeah. Marta, is there anything in this bill or other sort of federal initiatives to capture the kind of work, to reach out or offer assistance to the kind of workers you were talking about who maybe aren't employed in formal daycare settings?
So interestingly enough, in the first proposal, there was a considerable amount of money that was planned for home care aides as part of the Medicaid expansion plan. It was supposed to be $400 billion. And that was in the first negotiations. It was still part of the first infrastructure plan that actually just got approved last week, finally. But it got out of that bipartisan plan, and it got moved to the bigger social safety net bill, which is still pending. But there's still, as far as I know, and who knows what's going to happen, but there's supposed to be $150 billion allocated for home care aides as part of the expansion of Medicaid, still considered for the future bill. And this is actually really good news, because in the end, home care aides are actually the biggest number of domestic workers. There's at least 1.4 million home care aides working, both in terms of part of like people who work for agencies and people who work independently, but still, these are people who do support or provide care for mostly the elderly and disabled people at home. So it's still good news. Of course, when it comes to all the domestic workers who are undocumented or don't have access to any kind of contract or benefits of any kind, these are still pretty much left out of any of the infrastructure plans.
And as we know, these types of care work are all interconnected, right? A family who has an elderly relative at home that needs constant help, that impacts their ability to then deal with their children and to pay for childcare and all of these things, right? So these are all snowballing effects and interrelated.
And the lines are very blurry too, because a lot of people like have a nanny, but then the nanny also cleans the house and also cooks for the whole family. Like, it gets tricky sometimes with domestic work. There's no clear job description, and a lot of times it includes a lot more work than they're supposed to be doing.
Right. Yeah. Kendra, do you want to add anything to this on the bill?
Yeah, no, I think that covered it. I mean, I guess I would say the other thing I've been following is just how much time with the childcare piece states have to get this up to speed. And I think it's really fast when you look at how it's like 3 years. And when you look at other pre-K programs, with the exception of New York, which was super fast, it's a really short timeline. So, but it's overall, I mean, I think with the childcare side, it's pretty amazing. And we've seen nothing like it for 50 years.
Yeah. So speaking of the 50-year timeline, I want to zoom out for a second and talk about how, 24-hour childcare on demand was once like a core demand of like women's lib manifestos in the 70s. How did we get from there to where we are now, where we have this patchwork cobbled together, jump through hoops to get a tax credit kind of system, and where, despite the fact that childcare is like a very popular policy position, everyone's for it in theory, right? Like we haven't seen like a mass movement to get better childcare and more affordable childcare, or for that matter, 24-hour government-run daycare centers. Bryce, you want to speak to this a little bit?
Yeah, I'd love to. It's really interesting. If you go back to the 1970s, there was this really common demand for, like you said, it was 24/7 childcare on demand. And it was not just to help women work. It was the idea that you could drop your kid off and go to a museum or go to a protest, whatever you were trying to do in your life, there was childcare available for you. That basically sort of ran aground on Richard Nixon. The movement sort of culminated in this bill, the Comprehensive Child Development Act in 1971. It would not have been the vision that women had in the women's liberation movement to have this really bold 24/7 operation, but it would have created a network of childcare centers throughout the country that would have been universal and open to everyone. And it was quite bipartisan. It passed Congress on bipartisan lines. Richard Nixon had supported child development and was saying that he wanted something like this. So everyone assumed that he would sign it. And then Pat Buchanan basically whispered in his ear and convinced him to veto it. And his veto didn't just kill the bill, which it did. It really just sent this message and created this toxic aura around childcare that hadn't really existed before. He likened it to communism. He said it was going to destroy American families, things that we have heard in the years since, but that was sort of a new way for Republicans and conservatives to be talking about it. The very next day, he signs into law tax credits for childcare. And so he shoots down the universal system that would have created this robust network of federally funded and regulated centers, and instead just sends money to parents and that creates our patchwork private system. You know, it basically flourishes from there because there's a little bit more money in parents' pockets. We get the system we have now, which is basically you are on your own as a parent to go find a private provider somewhere and hope that it's good quality and hope that you can afford it. And it also, that system, while really lacking, takes a bit of the urgency out of the issue. There is now something for parents to have, and it also bifurcates it. So, you know, poor parents eventually start getting subsidies. There's early Head Start. Everybody else is dumped into the private system. And so the cross-class call for 24/7 childcare for all fades away. And that's where we are today. The issue then gets wrapped up in the culture wars around working women. The evangelical right starts hammering on this and saying that childcare is communism and it's going to indoctrinate your children and women belong at home with their children. That is basically where we were up until pretty recent years. And it's hard to build a movement around this issue these days. You know, you're asking parents to organize when they have very little time, very few resources, and it's a really urgent matter for them then. And then they get their kids into school and it eases a lot. And so you've got a couple of years where parents are just really in the thick of it, but they also have no time to do anything about it. So it's a tough issue to organize around. And I also think this country has done a really good job of telling parents that it's their own personal problem to solve. So you first have to sort of get people to see this as a collective issue and one that they share with other families and could do something about if they all banded together. So there's just like all these steps that have to happen before there's a mass movement, even though it is an extremely popular policy. I was part of doing some polling for Lux Magazine for a piece I have forthcoming on the question of universal childcare, and it is really popular amongst everyone, especially amongst Democrats, especially amongst the Democratic Party base of young people, of people of color. People really like this idea. They don't think it's all that radical or crazy. It's just that it hasn't really made its way into politics.
Yeah. And Kendra, you've also been writing a lot about kind of some of the ideological underpinnings behind this, like, right, why we are very fixated on choice when it comes to childcare. And not only childcare, schools more broadly, and obviously many other aspects of American life. But can you talk about why choice is such a powerful driver in designing these types of programs, and childcare in particular?
Yeah, I think the idea of needing to preserve parents' choice of options in childcare, it's used in a couple of different ways. But it always comes wrapped in this idea that parents know, like Bryce was saying, parents know what's best for their small kids, and they're the experts. And on the surface, that sounds, good and benign, and it makes a lot of sense, but it is rooted in history. It's rooted in this discomfort that kind of happened in 71 with this discomfort with the government interfering in families' lives. And that was, just exactly as Bryce was saying, you have the 60s, you have this universal childcare movement, you have bipartisan support for a federal funded childcare system. Then it goes to the desk of President Nixon. He vetoes it, and he casts this shadow over it, saying it causes family weakening. It's the government shouldn't meddle here, affiliating it with communism. And so then that's where we are now, kind of setting parents loose into the system, which has like this huge array of different choices, and kind of letting them at this really exhausting time of their life try to puzzle it out. And as it turns out, quality isn't easy to assess in childcare. It's pretty tough, and parents aren't great. Research shows that parents aren't very good assessors of quality. But just, for argument's sake, even if parents could assess quality really quickly and accurately, there's just not choice. So it makes this choice thing empty rhetoric. About 50% of families American families live in a childcare desert, which means there aren't any, there's not enough childcare to go around of any type. And then our childcare is first defined also by our employers' needs. Do they need weekend care? Do they need us to be flexible at the last minute? So your options narrow even more. And then finally, of course, is the affordability piece, which is, all of our options are defined by what we can and can't afford. And so for programs in this market-based system, what that means is they're usually competing with each other based on keeping their childcare affordable to the parents they serve. And that usually means to do that in this system, you have to serve as many kids as possible and pay teachers as absolutely little as possible to keep the costs down. And so neither of those things, of course, lead to quality care. But in the public, to answer the question about public assistance and what does it mean for subsidized childcare, it's kind of used a little differently, which in the subsidized childcare world, the rhetoric of choice has historically been used to fund childcare options that are cheap. And this kind of happened during the 90s when there was welfare reform and a lot more parents were getting to these vouchers to use in the childcare, of their choice. And at least in New York City, a lot of what would happen was they'd go, they couldn't find a program to take their children. So they'd go back to the public assistance office and would be told, well, where's your child now? Oh, she's staying with my neighbor down the street. Well, why don't you use the voucher to have your neighbor permanently look after her? And so this isn't really about choice. It's about finding something that's available and something that's inexpensive to fund. And this is also the time when family childcare was exploding. And these are the programs where providers often look after a small group of neighborhood kids in their homes, often in their living rooms. And it's not that, and there's some amazing family childcare programs out there. However, these programs are often receive way less oversight, way less resources. The teachers are paid less than they are in centers. And so again, what happens is you're putting the burden on parents to try to figure out, where are those amazing programs and what is the quality here? And that's a lot to burden parents with. And then I guess the final thing I'll say about family childcare is it's very, because they're small, geographically scattered programs, quality improvement measures are much harder and more expensive to distribute there. So what happens is when it's the government funding, too often, these are the measures that do get dropped. So I guess what happens is honoring parents' choice to choose childcare too often gets used as a way to fund inexpensive options and kind of for the government to abdicate responsibility for making sure those options are all really high quality.
Yeah. Marta, to turn to you again, so one of the open secrets of the U.S. childcare system is that it's also undergirded by the labor of largely immigrant women who do a lot of childcare, especially for wealthy and middle class families, in a largely unregulated sphere. Can you talk a bit about what your reporting shown about sort of working conditions and also organizing among those workers, and how it kind of differs from this. We have this one debate about, like, the above board childcare, and then there's this sort of much less talked about world of domestic work.
Right. So one of the main things that I should mention is that it's very hard to find data on domestic workers. And that's been one of the frustrations also for researchers, academics, and policymakers as well, right? Because we're talking about actually a pretty big population. There's at least 2.2 million domestic workers in the United States. I personally think this is a very conservative estimate, but unfortunately, there's very little data available. There is some data in terms of the current population survey, but that's 60,000 households only as a sample. Basically, there's, as I said, all these challenges in terms of finding these workers and reaching out to these workers. And then when the pandemic happened, I was just instantly interested in knowing how it was affecting them, because I worried about them. I saw the unemployment numbers go up, and I was like, what about all these women who are nannying and cleaning houses and taking care of the elderly, who don't have contracts and cannot apply for unemployment, but need the money and need the help, and it's urgent. And I feel that this lack of options in terms of knowing about their situation also keeps them out when there's plans or emergency plans that are being passed at the legislature. And I think that it was very interesting that the National Domestic Workers Alliance used a very easy tool, which was basically Facebook. On Facebook, you can create chatbots. And they had been experimenting with this technology before the pandemic just to get information about these workers, particularly Spanish speaking workers. And when the pandemic started, they were like, we really need to switch into emergency mode. We need to know what's going on. So they started running these weekly surveys with the workers to kind of find out what's going on. And I also thought that it was very interesting that for them, it was very important to put the person before the data gathering, right? Like they saw this as they call it form of care. And I thought it was very interesting that they wanted the workers to feel that someone was listening, someone wanted to help and was there to listen to them. And they got a lot of responses. They've been reaching out to them weekly since the pandemic started in March 2020. And they do this, like they haven't stopped since then. And they're reaching over 80,000 workers every week. So this is super valuable information for policymakers, for government, for researchers, for everyone. And I kept thinking that there's all these gig workers out there, and even growing number of people who are relying on gig work to make a living. And these people fall out of the regular ways of, counting how employment works, how you have access to other kinds of benefits from government. And I felt that what the Domestic Workers Alliance was doing was very innovative in terms of democratizing the access to that kind of information and to real-time data, which has been so difficult and so important in such a vital crisis like the economic crisis that unfolded from the pandemic. And what they saw is, for instance, in a matter of weeks, over 90% of domestic workers reported having lost jobs. 90%, over 90%. And then 2 months into the pandemic, 70% reported having no jobs at all. And as I said before, 3 out of 4 of these domestic workers were the main breadwinner in their families. So this is like shocking data. And then if you look at the progress, it's very interesting because 6 months into the pandemic, I think it was like over 50% of them were still having trouble paying rent. And this is something that I have come across all the time in my research. I've been speaking to a couple dozen domestic workers over the course of the pandemic. And even today, they're still struggling. A lot of them are struggling to pay rent. And what the NDWA data shows, if you look at the data they just issued from September, for example, the people who are still having trouble with paying rent is pretty much still at 50%. I think it's 48% right now. So we see that this economic crisis is very deep. And yes, we keep talking about how the economy is recovering, like all these new jobs opening up. But for a lot of people, and the people we often don't hear from and don't see, it is not happening. And they're very, very far from recovery. And I feel that through this very easy project, which was a Facebook chatbot, it was very interesting to see how NDWA was able to get very valuable information on how the pandemic is affecting this particular group. But the same could be said for so many other gig workers, right? Like, I wish Uber or Lyft would, disclose data on how the pandemic is affecting drivers, but they haven't, right? And they have a lot of access to technology that would allow them to give that data, right? So basically, we see that they're still struggling. The majority talk about being underemployed, like having a couple of jobs still, but that means like going to a home or cleaning a home a couple of times a month. So it's not enough for them to provide for their families in most cases.
Yeah, you can imagine the sort of add-on effects of different businesses closing, people not being in offices, sort of
Yes,
cutting back.
people still not trusting as well, like bringing people inside their homes. A lot of workers did express that fear. And I also wanted to mention that this is a very emotionally taxing job. This is not a job where you go to the office from 9 to 5 and you're done and you forget about what you're doing. These are people who are taking care of children, who are taking care of the elderly. And I think it's one of the hardest jobs. And, it's such a big responsibility. And still, like, they're paid, I think the average pay is $12 an hour. So way below the average pay for most workers. And it's also been very hard for a lot of them to kind of suddenly be shut down from that relationship that they've been building throughout years. I remember talking to one domestic worker in particular. She was a nanny. She had been taking care of a kid since the baby was 4 months old and the kid was 6 years old right now during the pandemic. And from one day to the other, she got sick with COVID. She informed the family. And then they said, you don't need to come back. And she felt horrible. She was like, I feel like a mother that has abandoned her children. So I think that sometimes we also forget that this is a job that emotionally also brings a lot. And it's not easy to deal with these things on a regular basis.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point. And it's, I've seen some quotes as well from childcare workers who talking about how, they were about to quit and go work at Starbucks because it was a higher wage. And, they're like, how is that possible that I'm going to be paid more for like the future of America's children, paid less for the, helping shape the future of America's children than, making America's coffee. So,
I was just going to jump in and say, I think a lot of that also happened amongst family childcare workers when the pandemic, first hit and everything locked down. They were the people who were told, stay open, be open for the essential workers, with no guidance, with no protocol. Many have no health insurance, are older, and then often, many I spoke with back at the very beginning of it kept their programs open, but people weren't coming in. So it was this weird quietness where there was this talk of stay open, figure out how this will work, because we've shut the schools, but you're the ones open. And then it was just kind of empty. So it's a, yeah.
Well, and at the beginning, we were talking about things that the pandemic has exposed. And I think right now, the stage we're in is exposing the low pay, the lack of benefits, the really difficult work this is. There's a huge childcare shortage now because of the labor shortage. It's the economy is tightening. Their employers are trying to hire. And Cora, like you said, I think a lot of childcare workers are looking around and going, I could make a higher wage at a fast food restaurant or at Starbucks. What am I doing? This is really hard work and I'm not being rewarded. So they're not coming in. It's dangerous work in a pandemic. There still is a pandemic and you're exposing yourself coming in every day in person with kids. You don't know what their families are doing. And there's a lot of people who are now unable to get childcare because the spots are being reduced because the providers can't hire people. There are entire daycare centers shutting down because they just can't get enough staff. And this is not completely out of the ordinary before the pandemic. The margins of this business don't make any sense. You make very little profit as a provider, if you make any profit at all. And you're pouring it all into staff salaries, and yet you can barely pay them anything. It's just a broken market. If the government doesn't get involved here and invest here, this very extreme problem we're experiencing right now really won't go away. We are not going to have quality childcare that the parents and the children need, and the providers are going to either keep working for terrible wages, really doing this backbreaking work, or they're going to leave.
So I want to talk about how, we tend to look at all of these individual policies in a vacuum, right? We think of one of you already mentioned that we need to think about school and childcare together as pieces of one piece. And we recently ran a piece talking about the dangers of splitting up universal pre-K and childcare assistance, for example, which gets precisely to the problem of wages. If people can go work for get better wage, a guaranteed wage at a pre-K in a prepay program, that's going to impact the childcare slots available. And also, parents' schedules need to be, you can't just have pre-K, right? You need the daycare as well. So that's one childcare specific element, but I think we could broaden it a bit to talk about some other things that are on the table right now. Immigration, for instance, paid leave, which is another roller coaster in the experience following its ins and outs of the reconciliation bill. And, we could also talk about reproductive health, obviously, abortion access, all of these things that are bubbling up right now. So, yeah, I'd love to hear from you all on how, these things, these interconnected aspects of our political moment and what they have to do with care work. It's a huge question, I know.
I can jump in quickly on the question of childcare and paid leave and universal preschool. I mean, first to start with paid leave, it almost feels obvious, but I guess it has to be said that, if you don't offer guaranteed paid leave, parents are going to need childcare much earlier. If you're talking about, oh, well, I don't like childcare because I want parents to be with their children, then you need to give them paid leave so they can be with their children. Paid leave has come in and out of this bill. Joe Biden wanted to do 12 weeks of paid leave, which is, in my opinion, not even nearly enough. Then it was taken out. Now it's in at 4 weeks. It might be maternity leave only, which would mean that people who need to care for elderly loved one, disabled loved ones, sick loved ones would just be left high and dry. But that's part, you start the system with some paid leave so parents can bond with their children, recover from whatever birth experience they might have gone through, and really establish those relationships. And then you offer them high quality childcare after they've had some time to do that by themselves. And then childcare and preschool really interact with each other. Like you said, on a wage basis, you're going to lose people to education if they can get higher wages there. If you pay people better in preschool than you do in childcare. But also, if you enact universal preschool and don't touch the childcare system, you make the childcare business even harder. And just in terms of like the profit model, because older kids are cheaper and easier to care for. You don't need as many teachers for a 4-year-old to be around as you do for an infant. And so it becomes even more expensive to provide care if those 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds are now sort of leached out into a preschool system. That's exactly what's happened in New York City, because we have universal pre-K for 4-year-olds and we're expanding 3K. And the city hasn't really done much on childcare subsidies. It's become much harder to be a childcare provider in the city. So we could lose a lot of those providers if they can't make the profits work. So it all hinges on each other. A system would have all these pieces in place and have them really well funded and thought out, and then it really would work like a continuum and a system. And instead, that's kind of not what we're talking about.
Anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, I guess I'll add, and that's all absolutely, I agree with everything that Bryce just said. One thing that this bill is proposing, which is kind of a big deal, but doesn't get talked about as much, is it wants to make pre-K a mixed delivery system. And actually, when New York City kind of messed up and did pre-K, which was a huge success, but damaged the childcare market, what we learned here was that 3K we needed to involve, partly for practical reasons, but also for to help providers, we needed to involve the family childcare market, and we needed to engage those providers and let them be 3K providers, which was actually kind of a radical idea at the time. But now this is the pre-K, the preschool model that we're going to be delivering, which is offering 3K and pre-K in this, lots of different mixed delivery. Means you'll have centers, you'll have public schools, you'll have family childcare. And that is one way to let providers, to help them make their business models work without toppling the market. But yeah, I absolutely agree. All these pieces work together, and you can't isolate them and still have it work as a seamless system at all.
I guess I would just add, and this is just a very broad idea. I feel like all the issues that you kind of talked about, Cora, it brings back the idea of all this work, caregiving or reproductive work, not being considered as it has an economic value. I think that it all goes back to that, right? Like since the beginning of the 20th century, it's been even codified by law that, housework, domestic work, taking care of the kids in the family is part of women's work, and that this has no value for an economy and for a society that shouldn't be paid. So I think it all, stems from there, and the fact that it's always been considered something that we have to do as women, just because we're women. And it's part of our role in society. So I feel like it all goes back to this idea that it's not considered quote unquote real work in so many ways.
Right. And these are also things that can be offloaded from government, or are no longer the responsibility of government, or as soon as you say something, belongs in the home or is a private issue or is women's work, right? It's no longer the responsibility of government. It's no longer the responsibility of employers. Despite the fact, as we've all talked about, that this is what employers need. Employers need their workers to be able to come to work. They need their workers to be able to raise children. There's been a lot of fixation on declining U.S. birth rate, for instance. And one reason for that is that a lot of people acknowledging that the U.S. is not actually a great place to have a child right now. It's very expensive, and not a lot of support from employers or government or communities. And that's all coming into pretty sharp relief. So just for one last round, and on a slightly more hopeful note, and I'm looking out for questions. Don't see any yet from the audience, but so in the absence of federal action, as we've all kind of muddled through the last year and a half, there have been some examples of communities kind of creating their own solutions. So some cities have launched their own programs, and we talked a little bit already about universal pre-K in New York and some of its drawbacks, but there was also been a successful campaign for universal childcare in Portland. We've heard about these organizing initiatives by groups like the National Domestic Workers Alliance, mutual aid during the pandemic, right? Childcare pods, and sort of swaps and every other way that people patch together a system. So what are some of, like, what can we learn from some of these examples, from the ways communities have responded to this crisis? And like, sort of, what are some of your favorite things that you've heard about? Whoever wants to start.
I mean, kind of sticking with the state level, I think Massachusetts and Vermont both are considering universal childcare bills, and it has been it's been really a positive thing that people are talking about this. And when they're talking about it, like with Massachusetts, they're making one of their big points is to try to make sure that early childhood educators get paid on par with K through 12 teachers. And there's like a understanding of what the issues are, and trying to really make this work. And and smaller things, like in North Carolina, there's a program that I think is available widely beyond North Carolina to subsidize, to give teachers more money than they would get in their childcare program based on the training they receive. So there are these attempts to kind of patch together the holes that have been left in the void of government support.
Bryce, do you want to talk about Portland maybe, or?
Sure. This is also in my upcoming Lux Magazine article. I spoke to the organizers in Portland who, in the, not this week's election, but last year's election, they passed a measure to levy a tax on wealthy residents in the Portland area, and with that money fund universal preschool in their county. And what's cool is that they were very unabashed about it being universal for all. They rejected means testing. There was a competing ballot measure initially that wanted to do more of a means tested targeted approach. And they sort of railroaded over them and showed that there was really overwhelming support for something big and bold. And they talked a lot about workers too in the campaign. They said to me, even people who aren't parents, aren't thinking of becoming parents, or maybe they're older and that's all behind them, when they found out how little childcare providers make, they were just shocked and appalled and said, yeah, these people need to be making way more than that. I'm totally on board. So they were able to bring in a wider group of people to support it based on that worker issue and class issue. And it's really significant. When it gets up and going, it has a ton of funding. They're going to do it really high quality, really get it out to all the children. It's really not a half measure. I think sometimes these things that places will call universal preschool or childcare end up being a little bit less than what it sounds like. This is like full bore. So it's really cool. And it was all organized. It was sort of spearheaded by the Democratic Socialists of America. Just young organizers coming together, young and old, but a lot of young parents coming together and saying, we want to do this. And I think it's a model that, Portland is its own unique place, but it can be transported to other areas too. There's, I think, energy to be tapped around this issue. They certainly tapped into it, and I think there's probably other places that can do it too. So it's cool to see people just sort of taking it on and doing it at the local level. I want to see if other places decide to do it too.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, like figuring out how to broaden this issue beyond just something that women are interested in, that parents are interested in, that parents of toddlers are interested in, because as you said, people kind of age out of the immediate interest group for this issue. But I think that as we all seen, the pandemic has kind of shown how interconnected these things are and how disruptive lack of childcare can be to all kinds of things. And also just like people have, I think a degree of more interest in how, they can build broader community structures and get people who aren't directly impacted by an issue involved. Marta, is there anything you'd add? Any sort of organizing initiatives or mutual support that you've seen in your reporting?
I was just going to say that it was interesting to see how the domestic workers who, there's a big barrier in terms of for them to connect with each other, because it's also a very lonely job. You go to your clients' homes and that's pretty much it. You don't get to kind of meet with a lot of peers. And I think that it's interesting to see that technology can be very helpful in terms of getting them to connect with each other. There's this Facebook page that the NDWA has. They do these weekly meetings, like live streams on Facebook, where all the workers get together, and they have like city chapters and state chapters. And it's impressive to see that sometimes there's like 200 people in the New York meeting every week. I think that this is a beautiful thing to see for women who feel so invisible, to be listened to and to be able to share their experiences once a week and to notice that people do care. So sometimes technology, has had very positive effect. And I do have to say that I'm originally from Spain. So when it comes to like childcare and universal childcare, I'm like, yes, of course. Sorry, that's my personal opinion.
No, it's an important perspective. I mean, I think we talked about the example of Quebec, but it's easy to forget that this is a very American debate sometimes.
I went on Brian Lehrer to talk about universal childcare, and he just in New York City, this is a New York City based radio program, asked people to call in if they had experience with international childcare. And everyone called in and was like, what is going on in this country? Like, I was in Germany, I was in Lithuania, and they like all these countries, and they had so many different ways of getting childcare support. It was really good quality. They're like, and then I moved here and I was like, what are we doing? So we're a real outlier, I think, is the lesson to be learned from that.
All right. Well, I've so enjoyed talking to all of you, and this has been a really great conversation, and I hope that you'll all visit the New Republic and check out Kendra and Bryce and Marta's latest stories and all the other work that they've done for the magazine, for Latino USA and other publications. And yes, wish you all a good night, and thanks so much for being here.